And yeah, so today, as you probably all know, we will be talking about a very hot topic that seems to like never get completely figured out in the design industry, and that is the collaboration between the UX designer and the developer. We've heard a lot about a lot of struggles or things that can go bad. We've also heard happy stories, and we just want to explore how we can make this collaboration better and what are some pitfalls or things that we should be careful. What are some things that we as designers can foster or encourage or do in order to make this collaboration better, and so on. So, this is going to be a very interesting conversation. Hi everyone. I'm starting to look at the locations and it's really interesting to see so much diversity. So yeah. So now I'm gonna go ahead and introduce my our guest for this evening, Alex. Alex is a front end developer, and he's always teaching. He's also teaching front end at university, and he has a very nice initiative of educating people about front end. So he has a very nice background, and I think that he will bring a lot of value to this conversation. But I'm gonna invite him to say hello and to share a couple of words about himself. So, hi, Alex, and thanks for accepting this invitation.
Hi, Ioana. Thank you very much for having me. Hey, everyone. Nice to see you. As Ioana said, I'm Alex. I'm a front-end developer from Romania. I've been doing front-end since 2015, so it's already 6 years. Time flies. I also like a lot teaching front-end, so I'm also teaching it at the local university and doing some trainings and workshops on the side. And as she mentioned, I also have an open sourced initiative. It's only in Romanian, in the Romanian language right now, but we're gonna also get an international domain. It's called frontend.ro, where it's an open source project and we try to teach people frontend. Also, I think it would be useful to say that I've had like one, let's say, normal job from like for about 2-3 years, and then I've been a freelancer. So I worked in quite a lot of projects, both with designers and without designers. And I can say from the start, I really like the projects where there are designers. So yeah, that's a short intro for me. I hope to be a fun, productive meetup.
Yeah, definitely. I think so too. I really hope that I don't screw up something with organizing all the Zoom things over here. Yeah. So I'm just trying to figure out what are all the functionalities that I have to work with. It's not that hard, but still, yeah. And a last disclaimer before jumping into the conversation, I just want to let everyone know that this meeting is being recorded and we will probably upload it on YouTube if I'm able to like save the recording and not screw something up. So with that being said, I will go straight into the first question or the intro question for tonight, which is kind of something that always comes up, at least in conversations or questions that designers get. And I think it's really valuable to get the perspective of the developer on this question. So a very hot question that even Alex got on his Instagram in preparation for for this event is if designers should know how to code. And I've always shared my thoughts around that. I'm really curious to hear what is his perspective as a developer as to if designers should learn how to code.
Yeah, so I think, so for me, the short answer is no. I don't think, now I'll say think because, you know, I've never like taught people or mentored people in design. So I'm talking from my developer side, but if I can make a parallel, when I got hired for my first developer job, I didn't know design, I didn't know backend, I didn't know like database and stuff. So I knew only like front end when I got my junior job. So I can assume that's the same for a UX designer. Now, this being said, I think it's an advantage, not only if a designer knows a little bit of how to code, but also on the other side, if a developer knows a little bit of design. I think it's an important thing. So now to talk it more specific, I think it helps communicating with the developer. So if you know a little bit about like what's this black magic, what are they doing, like a little bit of HTML, a little bit of CSS, you don't even need to know all that much, like just the general stuff when you talk with them, when you discuss like requirements, how long is this going to take, so on and so on. I was also thinking, I recently was working in Webflow. I usually do, I mean, I just recently used it. Webflow is a tool to build pages, like drag and drop stuff. So I was thinking maybe that's something that a designer could do. Like if you implement the design and then just, if you want to have fun and also learn a little bit, just go into Webflow and try and implement it and see how hard or easy it is, because you might be surprised.
I love that answer. And yes, yes, I also want to just add my very brief perspective as a designer on it. I think that indeed the short answer would be no, but definitely like Alex said, it's gonna serve as a sometimes significant advantage in the way you communicate, in your communication, and how easy it is to collaborate with developers. So it's definitely it definitely builds bridges. So it's a really nice to have skill. I wouldn't say that it's mandatory in the sense that, oh, if I don't like coding, then I will not pursue a design career, because that's like mandatory condition. It's not, but it's definitely a nice to have skill, and it will help you loads when collaborating with developers. And now, since we're talking collaborating with developers, and this is like the key word for tonight, collaboration, I just want to start with a very nice and in-depthful email that I got from a member of the UX Goodies community. I'm going to start by reading that email because I feel that it serves as a fantastic intro to the topics or the areas that we will be trying to explore today. And this email, I feel, also speaks to many of us, both to the designers, and if there are any developers in the audience, probably to themselves as well. So I will go ahead and read the email, and then we'll use it as an intro or a foundation for the questions that will follow. The email goes like this, and thank you, Dennis, for sending it. I really appreciate that you're so involved with. Unfortunately, Dennis couldn't attend to ask the question live, so he prepared everything on email. This is Dennis Driscoll. I'm sending you an email about your discussion on the design engineering. Sorry, I'm gonna jump over that. Okay. I'm the senior director of UX design for a medium-sized ad agency. While also studying for my master's degree, our client list runs the spectrum from Fortune 10, 100 companies to small nonprofits. Our digital team consists of around 30 people, with about half being engineers. So my main question for the discussion: is there ever a smooth handover process? When handing over UX UI documents, including specifications, we've exhausted quite a few avenues, and still there are issues when it comes to the final build. Our current process is, and I think this is very interesting, at least one engineer team member is involved in the design process, from initial kickoff to discovery meetings with the client to ideation and concepting. This is important. We need to make sure everyone involved in the process understands the ultimate ask and the audience we're building for. Once the design process is complete, documents are sent to the engineering team to allow them a few days to explore the designs, read the spec, poke holes, and come up with questions. However, if I'm honest, it seems as though most do not read the spec ahead of time. We then meet to discuss each aspect of the designs, including a run-through of all the components and critical functionality. I will actually sit and read the spec line by line to make sure everyone understands what is required. It's exhausting. Then build starts. However, we still run into issues where the final product isn't built to the specification. It seems the engineers would rather look at the design and assume they know how it should be built rather than read the associated specification to see if there are any accessibility or client-specific asks that need to be accommodated. Okay, I have to admit that it's something that I resonate with, in the sense that I've noticed, and in working with developers, I've seen I'm doing admin work now. I've seen that there's like not a reluctancy necessarily, but for developers, it's a lot of time that needs to be invested in reading the specs and going through every detail. And somehow for them, it's faster or easier to just look at a design and then decide how to build it. I'm not sure if that's the case. Maybe you could share more from your perspective, Alex, how it is when you get the specs, or if you prefer something that's more simplistic, or how would you go about the handover process in an ideal way from your perspective?
So I can totally relate to that. There are a lot of memes online that like 6 hours of trial and error can save you 5 minutes of reading documentation and stuff like that. So I admit us developers can be like, okay, we got this, let me just start coding and not looking on the docs or on the designs and so on. So yeah, I totally get that. I think he's doing a lot of things right, like involving the developers early on. I think that's really great. And then giving them time to process the information and come up with additional questions. Now, I'm a little bit skeptical on the reading it line by line. I mean, I personally would prefer like maybe just give me like the summary of the most important things, like this is what you need to be careful of, and then I'll take care of the rest. But I'm talking from like what I like. This is my approach. I prefer to like, you know, just give me what's most important, and then I'll look over design, I'll figure out the rest. So maybe like I'll try to do a change in this direction. Now, if they still have problems with the final with the shipped let's say page or the website, well, I mean, I'm not much of a manager, but I don't want to give necessarily advice here, but I usually think that when there's like a group responsibility or something, you know, like if we have to do something, then nobody does it. So what I would do is maybe like pick like a lead developer for each small project, and then he's gonna be the one who's in charge, and he has to manage the rest of the developers. So that way you need to, you know who you're talking to, and if there are like recurring problems, you can go like, look, like what's going on? Do we need to change the format of the spec? Do we need to give you more time? Do we need to, I don't know, like, yeah, those are my ideas. I'm curious what you think.
Yeah, I feel I resonate with that. I like the idea of accountability. I think that this is something that's very, very common in any design process in general. That I think people need to know that they're responsible for something. So holding people accountable, having someone that's actually in charge of making sure that happens. And I think in some companies there's like I think sometimes the product manager is the one who should make sure that everything is like well communicated. And I think this is an interesting conversation. Where does the product manager fit in the design handoff development process? But we'll get to that as well. I would also want to ask you, maybe build on some things that you've already shared, from your experience so far and from what you've learned by maybe talking to other developers or being in the industry for many years now. And I have my own set of observations. What are the things that um, go bad in projects when it comes to handoff? What are some common pitfalls or common issues, maybe even common frustrations of developers? And I can even start with the design one. So definitely one of them is the fact that sometimes, too often maybe, the final design doesn't look like the the mock-ups or the solution that the designer has proposed. And I do try to build empathy and understand that probably there were some limitations, there were some constraints. Everything is built under constraints. Everything is actually designed under constraints. And many times we have to make a trade-off, and we have to like um, do something like in a workaround type of approach. But what are some other problems that come up from your experience, if there's anything else that comes to your mind now?
So now just a quick point regarding Dennis's questions earlier, and I think it also builds on this. Maybe another thing, if they're using a design system, and I assume the developers, well, I mean, it depends on their projects, but they may have a set of components and stuff like that. Maybe they're not updated. So maybe like the designers work with some spec with how things should look like, but the developers actually have like an oldish version, which are like, well, let's just keep it for now. So that's just an idea. I'm throwing it out there for Dennis. Now, regarding what you said, I'll start from that. The final, like the final production build doesn't look like the design. Well, so I can tell you that as a developer, we can build pretty much anything. Like, and I usually, when I talk with designers, I tell them this at the start so that they don't feel they have to limitate themselves. Like, okay, I'm not going to build this. Like, you can, like in today's technology and what's possible on the web and mobile apps, like we can really build anything. Now, the question is, how long do we want to spend building that stuff? So this is where most of my conversations revolve around. And regarding the handoff process, I think it's great if you're involved early and if the designer gives the developer a little bit of ideas of where it's going to go. Like, look, I'm thinking of doing this. Like, what do you think? And then I can say, well, that's great. We already have a couple of components we can reuse for that. Or I can say, well, that's like a whole new thing. It's going to take 1 week and we want to ship this by the end of the, I don't know, by Wednesday. Can you do something simpler? So I think like recognizing, and I hope that's true for, right? I mean, it might not be true for all teams, definitely, but it would be good if it would be like this for all teams, that we all want the best for the product and for the end users. So that's why I say like I can and we can like pretty much build anything you come up with, but then let's see how much time that takes and let's see what other priorities out there. And let's find some middle ground, like what we're going to do.
I love that, and I also love a point that Laura made in the chat, that it's helpful to check from time to time with the developer about the details before the final handoff. Just what you said as well, that maybe it's important, and also what Dennis was doing, starting early, involving the developer early in the process, as early as possible, so he gets as soon as possible at least a high level understanding of where the solution is going towards. That's super valuable. And I think that another point that keeps coming up is understanding constraints. I feel that sometimes maybe this is just an assumption, but it's something that I've seen in some places that I worked in. Maybe designers are a bit overly optimistic in terms of what can be done, and that's not a bad thing. I love how you say that designers shouldn't limit themselves when they come up with a solution. I think that when you design, as you explore, as you diverge in the solution space, that's not the right moment to bring in constraints and like make your room for, make the space for exploration smaller. But at some point, you do have, as a designer, you do have to understand what are the constraints, what is the time pressure, what are the resources available, and just be reasonable about that. So I think that sometimes designers, they just come in with this very nice thing, and they want, maybe they have unrealistic expectations of what can be done in an agreed timeline or whatever. So maybe where I'm trying to get at is that some things that designers could do better is checking more often, involving the developer early, and also at the right time, understanding what are the constraints and what are the resources available. Do you have anything that you want to add to this, or if you have anything else that designers can do to help this relationship work?
I, I think also, so I totally agree with what you said. Now I'm going to say there are some things that developers also should do. I don't want to, like, this is not just one, for me, it's not just like one side, like developers should or designers shouldn't do this. I also think like developers are also a side of this relationship. So as you said, designers need to understand there are some constraints and then they may be overly optimistic. On the other hand, I feel like a lot of developers, they don't really want, like, if there's something new, you need to build it new. It takes a lot of time. But if you just do the old stuff, it's like easy peasy. So I've seen a lot of developers that don't want something new because, like, well, why don't we just do this the same way we've been doing it? That's why I try to not I personally try with all my designer relationships not to. That's why I say to them, like, we can build pretty much anything. I don't want to like limit them, because I know how powerful a designer is. If you think outside the box and if you come with useful new stuff that can be like super nice. I think developers should do a better way, should do better in this area, like be more open-minded, and also like embrace that something new shouldn't be like thrown out because, oh, it takes more time, but actually should be embraced because, well, like now we have like a new way of solving a problem. Maybe it's a better way. Maybe this way we'll differentiate ourselves from the competition. I've actually read an article quite some time ago regarding this. It said something like, is everybody building one of those free websites? And it was like, I don't know if you've seen it, it was like a wireframe of different websites. And it was like free variants, which pretty much all websites have. So I feel like here a designer can come and say, look, we're going to give our product a little edge and so on. So yeah, I think developers do also a lot in this understanding. I was reading in the chat. Sorry, but the question is.
Yeah, I know it's distracting. I know that I invite everyone to comment and have a conversation in the chat. We will pause as much as possible to pick up questions from the chat, and we will reserve at the end 15 minutes or 10 minutes to answer questions from the audience. So you can start asking questions in the chat, and we will park them from the Q&A at the end. I hope that I won't miss questions again. I'm normally not the admin and director of this event, but today I'm joining from our community account, and Radu is not here, so I'm doing the best I can. Yeah, so with this disclaimer over, I do love some of the parts you've said, and I love that you bring the accountability of a developer in the conversation. That definitely it's a two-way street, and it's not just about what designers can do better, but also developers. I do feel like, in my experience, I've noticed that there's some sort of reluctancy that developers sometimes have to what the designer brings in as a solution. And sometimes I felt, in my experience, sometimes I felt like they were like waiting for holes to poke at, or for mistakes in the design, or for things that don't make sense, or for edge cases that weren't being covered. And so I do believe that the designer should do his homework, her homework as good as possible, and go into conversation prepared. And from a designer standpoint, you need to cover as many, if not possible, all the cases, all the use cases of the product when you hand off and when you design the specifications, if you want. But many times there are some holes, there are some gaps, there will be things that will be overlooked. And sometimes I felt like developers were celebrating everything that was missing, or there was like some sort of, the designer is wrong. And I do feel, I don't understand why that happens. I think maybe it's because there's like this, sometimes it's a positive friction. I have to admit that developers are also challengers of the design solution, which is great. And that's where that sort of spotting mistakes comes in as a valuable approach. But sometimes, I don't know, I think they're just mean. Have you seen that in your, you seem like a very nice guy. I don't see you being mean, but many times I feel like developers.
I've seen it. I don't know why, but I've seen it. And I can tell you, I've seen cases in which, like, maybe you just need to put a button somewhere, and it's like you have a design system, so you know how the button looks like, and then the developer says, I want a screenshot of the button in the story, otherwise I'm not putting it. I need to know how it looks. And I'm like, come on, you just can just take it from there. You don't need to be honest, I mean, most of my designer relationships have been great. I have just like one, which is kind of bad mistakes were done on both parts. So now to coming back to Laura's point, that communication along the way, like even right now on the project I'm working on now, the designer Alex, like we talk frequently regarding tasks. So we say, okay, we got to build this, like just he does his stuff, and then it comes back to me like, this is where I'm going, what do you think? And I say, well, yeah, it's doable, or it's not doable, or it's super easy, it's complicated, or maybe we have some functional constraints, maybe because those may happen as well. Like maybe you make a user profile and you put all this nice user data, and then I'm like, well, we don't have all the data regarding the user. Like we only have, I don't know, the name, email, and age. So yeah. So I'd say communication, yeah, definitely is important. And another thing that might happen, I don't want to generalize, because sure, there are developers which are not like that, but I think if we would take like, I think overall developers are more introvert than UX designers. I don't have some statistics, but this is what I think. This is what I'm feeling. I don't know if you agree or not.
I agree. I totally. Or that's the feeling I have as well. Again, I don't want to make it like a general statement. Definitely, it's not a rule. But sometimes I think it's even by the nature of the job that they work more in their like, own computer. It's not that much collaboration, maybe except for the stand up where everybody shares what they're working on. But then they go back in the silo to work on whatever they have to work on. So yeah, please continue.
So what I would say regarding this is, like if you feel that the developer is more introvert, like don't be afraid to like reach out and say like, look, we're part of this together, we're in the same team, we both want the same thing. So if we work together more closely, things will move faster, things will move better, everybody wins. So maybe some developers, and I know some of them may need a little nudge, like, hey, let's, what's up, good morning, let's talk, let me show you what happened, and so on and so on.
I love this point. I love it. I was actually hoping that we were going to make this point. I think that it's really important that both sides work together on the relationship. And I think it sounds like it's a pretty silly advice. It's not about fancy handoff tools or frameworks for handoff or processes and improving. And it's just, it seems like it's very basic. But from my experience, again and again, it feels like it's one of the pillars of a good collaboration, fostering a trust relationship, having conversations, communicating as often as possible, and just trusting that we're both doing efforts in making the process better, in making the solution as good as possible, as fast as possible. Everybody's trying their best. So starting with that understanding and then building a relationship of trust, I think is what made a difference in my experience so far. And indeed, it may be that if you join a new team, let's say, it takes a while to like win over the development team and convince them that we're heading. So especially where the design role is something newer. In many companies, I think developers were first. So for them, it was weird when UX became so popular and all companies started hiring designers. There was this person that was telling them what to do, and maybe many of them to that point, they were also the designers. I've seen that very often. So for them, it was like they were losing responsibilities, or suddenly there was someone telling them how to do things, which can be frustrating. But again and again, I think that if we manage to establish a trust relationship and we communicate and we understand that we're aiming for the same things, then things should like shift a little as much as possible.
Yeah, and I can say, uh, definitely, I think maybe in a lot of companies, developers were first and they lost some responsibility. And I can say from my experience as a front-end developer, I had projects with and without designers in which I had to think of stuff. And I can say absolutely love when I don't have to think of this stuff. Like I imagine starting a project from scratch and I have to think, what font do I use? Well, to me, all the fonts look the same. I don't know. Like, do I just random a font from Google Fonts? What colors? Spacing? How should the buttons look like? Loading buttons, disable buttons. I'm like, well, if I can't think of this stuff and I just have to do it, like for me, that's great.
Okay, I'm happy to hear that this attitude is also out there. That designers are not just threatening, but they're also coming in to solve problems and make life easier for developers. And yeah, so earlier you've mentioned very briefly design systems, and I think it's an interesting topic when we discuss any collaboration between designers and developers. What are your thoughts about design system? Are there like over appreciated when it comes to how much they help this collaboration? Is it like what have you used them? Have they helped you? What are your thoughts and feelings around design systems?
Yeah, I've definitely used them and not used them in other projects. So I think they're really helpful. My philosophy is that and I'm talking about like front-end developers or mobile developers that are building the UI. So my philosophy is that a good developer shouldn't go to the designer for every small little detail, like shouldn't, spam you on Slack, like, hey, what color should this be? What font size, what so on. Like, I think for the small stuff or for the stuff that's already been done in the app, and this is kind of just like copy paste, we should be more independent, because it saves you time and it saves me time. Like, yeah. So I think this is where design systems really come in, and they enable this to happen. Like, now I don't have to come to you, Joanna, and say, hey, like, how should this drop down be? Like, what do you think of the box shadow? I don't know. How big should it be? What colors? I can just look in the design system, look at the components that we already have, and be like, okay, it's something very similar. I'm just gonna do it. And that way, I think also the designer is happy because he or she can focus on, maybe a new module is coming up, which takes a lot of attention. You have to do user research. You have to do all this stuff. Now you have one less developer to spam you. Oh my God, what do I do here? So I think this is where design systems really come in, and I think they're really useful. Yeah.
Yeah, I also feel that. I agree with you completely that they become like the single source of truth for how things should be implemented, and it's like they definitely ensure consistency, and they're a bit hard to maintain from a designer's perspective. So I think that especially in big companies where there are several products, there needs to be a roadmap for design systems, and there need to be people that are working probably just on the design system, at least one person, because otherwise it's gonna quickly become a mess even with the design system. But they're a pretty good method of ensuring that we communicate, we have the same language, so it bridges the language, if you want, gap. But yeah, I don't want to talk too much about design systems. I want to mention to the audience that on December 7th we're hosting an event about design systems. So if you're not already a member of the Mento meetup group, then make sure you subscribe to the events and join the event about design systems. Okay, so getting back to our conversation, another question that I have in terms of what could help this collaboration, like for example, design systems, what are your thoughts about handoff tools? Do you think they're needed? Do you think they're also overrated and just a good old Figma file will do? What's your experience so far? I've used a couple of handoff tools. I'm going to share my thoughts about it as well, but I'm really interested to hear your perspective.
So I think here you definitely have more experience. So for me, Figma and comments in Figma has been pretty much like the best so far. And I have to be honest, I haven't felt necessarily I don't know, a lack of something, or at some point that's where the comments come in, because sometimes the design is not enough. So then the designer also added some comments and some explanation, or I asked him some additional stuff in Slack. So what I can say is that, we can, like, starting from the bottom, like maybe we can work with a screenshot, or a good developer should be able to work with a screenshot as well. But having a Figma definitely helps a lot. So this is, I haven't used, and I didn't even know there are special tools for this. So maybe you can share your
Yeah. There are a couple of tools. There's like I think the most prominent one at some point was Zeppelin. I used Zeppelin for quite some time, and Abstract, Avocode. I think that was the name. And Envision was a tool that was like they were consistently promoting their handoff feature functionality. But yeah, so what I didn't never understood about that functionality was whether the developers were actually using the code snippets that were being generated. So because this is what a handoff tool, or at least that's where I think it does things better than just a regular. It also generates a bunch of code snippets that can be used, but I really think that that developers weren't actually using those, right?
Yeah. Now regarding the code snippets, yeah, I think there are also some Figma plugins that do this. they're a good thing. I mean, well, I don't want to speak for all developers. I haven't used them 100% ever, but sometimes I can just take them and be like, kind of like the wireframe is for the designer. That's like my wireframe. So I just take the code and like, okay, I'm just gonna delete some stuff because that's not the best way to do it. But yeah, it's helpful sometimes, definitely.
That's great. I always had a curiosity, and I can't believe that I didn't clarify it up to this point if developers were using that. So yeah, I was using Zeppelin. We were a big team. We had a lot of product managers working on different features. So for us, Zeppelin, for example, was a great way of actually communicating between ourselves. So we realized that by transitioning from Sketch to Figma, which Figma is more collaborative, or it is collaborative. Sketch, I think, also had the cloud where you could like share the design and invite everyone. But with Figma, things went easier, were seamless, were faster. And so when we transitioned to Figma, all the handoff tools became redundant. I think that also they had like this versioning features, and abstract, for example, helped us like keep track of the design versions of that file and everything, and we could create, it was quite similar, I think, to GitHub in terms of like creating branches and the master file and everything. But for designers, for me at least, it was a bit like over engineering, and it wasn't like you said, the Figma the Figma file and collaborating in Figma seemed to work as good. And we could also solve that problem of having everybody see the same thing and comment on the same thing. And so when as a company we transitioned to Figma from Sketch, all handoff tools were like redundant. It was interesting. Yeah. Okay. Wow, we have a couple of
Sorry. I just wanted to say one quick more thing regarding this, like the Figma and handing stuff off to developers. What I found, and I know those two are very specific, but I'm just gonna say them. What I found to be helpful is, one, if the designer names the layers. Like sometimes this is like really a lifesaver when I have to go in there and figure out, okay, because sometimes maybe I'm just doing Figma wrong, but I cannot click on the layer I want from the UI, so I have to find it in the panel on the left. So naming them. And then another thing I found useful is, we had a couple of tasks a while back where we had to put some background images. So the designer would do the vector background in Figma. So then I would have to export it to either vector or PNG or so on. So what I found interesting, because I had only viewer rights, if the layers weren't properly grouped, I couldn't export them as just one image. So then I would have to talk to and be like, hey, can you please group the layers so I can export the image? So yeah, those are two, I know, very specific things, but something I encountered, and I was like, yeah.
Yeah, it's really interesting you mentioned them, and I think that yes, designers should be held accountable for how messy their design files are. I'm awful with my design files because for many projects that I worked on, I was like the only designer, and I was using different ways of handing off, not directly through Figma. So I had absolutely no reason to be very neat and organized, because nobody was supposed to see that file except for when I had to leave on maternal leave, and a designer replaced me at my company, and she was like, what the hell is happening here? I mean, I'm messy as well, but this is something else. So definitely designers, I want to encourage everyone to be organized and keep your files clean and name your layers. As you can see, some people may suffer if we don't do that. I think that I'm going to ask one last question from my side, and then we move to the questions that already came up in the chat. We have, I think, a backlog of 4 questions. If anybody else has something on their chest, now is the time to ask it in the chat. Yeah, so I would say that my last question would be pretty generic in terms of how the ideal handoff process should look like. Let's recap some of the things we've talked about and maybe put it into like some sort of structure. I know that some things were mentioned, like involving the developer early on, but if you were like to start a project tomorrow and you have the designer by your side, how would things ideally go, and what tools would you use and everything?
So I definitely take, so, well, depending on the task, maybe there need to be several developers or designers working on it, but I would take like, okay, like who's in charge on the design side and who's in charge of the developer side, and like, okay, those people need to collaborate closely. What we said and what the guests in the chat also said, like each other should be, or I think you should start like everybody wants what's best for the project and for the user. And we can pretty much build anything, but let's see how long it should take and what are the constraints. So I think this is like a partnership and should be like a good one between a developer and the designer. Keep communication often. I would also implicate let's say the product owner or the CEO or whoever it is, because I've seen it and it happened to me a couple of times. I was working with the designer, we had it done, and then in that case was the CEO, because it was a small startup. It was like, no, we need to change this. So then the designer took like another half day of changing it. I took another half day of like implementing it. And then the CEO was like, no, we need to change it again. So I would definitely make sure the person who signs off the final like say is also involved. Yeah, I would use as tools, like those are the ones I know, but I'm sure maybe there are better ones, but I would use Figma, comments in Figma, and pretty much, yeah, an open attitude and trust, I think goes a long way. And yeah, that's pretty much.
Yeah, and I think that just a small note on the comments in Figma. I think that many times it's even when what we talk about at our boot camp with the UX students, annotations to your design are very valuable. So I think the comments in Figma act as annotations that explain what's supposed to happen, because some things let's say if you just show a static mockup, it's not a prototype, it's not clickable, it's not interactive, then some things may not be immediately apparent or clear, or the behavior of some elements might not be so easy to communicate. And that's where comments come in, that maybe explain more, expand on what's supposed to happen in that particular page, or in that particular screen or interaction or whatever. So yeah, so I think while we have 5 questions, let's try to answer as many as we can before we run out of time. The first question that came earlier from Laura is, should front-end devs know about UX design? It's the reverse question of how we started. So is it the other way around that?
Yeah, definitely. And I can personally say that it helps me a lot. I never did any like formal, let's say, UX learning, so I didn't take any boot camps. I've read some articles here and there, but just through practice and from doing a lot of websites and stuff, I think I picked up on the basic stuff, and it's definitely helpful. I think it makes me, I mean, and developers in general, much more independent, and we don't have to spam you for all the things. I mean, recently I was talking with a friend who actually wants to learn to be a UX designer, and this is like a real story. And she showed me a design in Figma, and she made a part of the text bold, and she told me, okay, this text is like a link, click on it and goes. And I said, well, I didn't understand this. I would make it underline, because everybody knows that underlined text is usually a link. So I think this is something I picked up by being a front-end developer and working on this. And I think it's really valuable for developers as well.
Yeah, I think, and also this is an interesting point. I think that developers, front-end developers in particular, like they kind of know UX because they're building interactions and interfaces, and so you learn by doing, in a way. Even if you like apply the design decisions of someone else, the designer in this case, you still learn by building them. So I think most developers kind of know at least UI design, if you want. Maybe they're not as involved or as aware of the research processes, of the discovery work that goes into a project, of everything that's like the more UX in the process. But definitely they understand interactions and how things should work and best practices. And I think that it all comes down to give my perspective on this question. I think that developers should know UX as much as UX should learn a bit of coding, because it really bridges the communication gap. It really helps speak, have a shared vocabulary, speak the same language, and it's easier like to collaborate. And that's essentially what we all need to do in the projects we're in. Okay, next question. The next question is from Elena. As a designer, from my experience with developers, they first say no to the new complex requests and say that can be done, but after a while, they do the request. Is there a way to manage this better? What are your suggestions?
Yeah. So again, unless it's some like, sci-fi, maybe self-driving cars, which already exist, but unless it's like that type of requirement, and we're talking about UI interfaces, we can pretty much build anything. I mean, there are some like amazing websites out there that you look at them, and I look at them, I'm like, holy, how did they build this? So this is what I wanted to tell you, that when a developer tells you, no, they cannot do it, that's most of the time they can do it. Now, what I would say, again, like communication is key. Like try and maybe get like let me put it this way. What I would do if I were a designer that wanted to get this implemented, I'd look over at different websites, or on websites like CodePen, where you can find examples with code, and then maybe share it and say, well, this looks similar. What do you think? Which is kind of like, hey, you're lying, we can actually build this. So, well, even though this is not the ideal approach, because ideally the developer would say, sure, let's see how we build this together. If you have someone like that on your team, I don't think it hurts to do a little bit of research on your own and be like, well, this looks similar, what do you think? Maybe this helps, and so on.
Definitely, I love that idea. And I actually love it when I see designers that are somewhat versed in coding, and they have they're able to articulate why they think that something could be done. This is another advantage to learning a bit of coding, that you are able like to have this conversation and say, hey, no, I think that could be done. And my take on Elena's question is that maybe yeah, it's been discussed in the conversation. Involving them early on will probably make that new complex solution feel less foreign, less new, less complex, if they're early on exposed to how that solution is being built or articulated. So I think that, if that makes sense. So maybe it feels new and complex because they see it very late in the process. Maybe if we move that earlier, then that's better for everyone. Okay,
And
so
also
wow.
just
Yeah.
one quick word. Maybe they didn't really understand why it's needed. I mean, this can be a valid point. Maybe if you come with something really sci-fi, maybe I look at it and say, well, maybe a simple drop down works. Why do we need to do all this mumbo jumbo stuff? So yeah, totally agree what you said, and just adding that maybe the explanation of why this actually helps the end users or the project and so on, that we need to build it.
Yeah, that's interesting. Actually, I think that what I see very often going bad in the designer developer collaboration is that designers can't always articulate why they made certain decisions, and that's like something that we should always be able to articulate. When the developer asks us, why isn't this like overly complicated, we must know why it's worth it. Cool. So another question from hi Regis, thanks for the question. Yeah, so his question is, what are the main things that would be helpful if designers knew about coding? Any specific language that designers, so if a designer wants to learn coding to help the collaboration, what should they learn?
So what I would do personally is I would first start with Webflow. I mentioned this in the beginning because that doesn't require any code, and you get a little bit of like the feeling of coding. So I would suggest like you take one of your designs, go into Webflow. They have a free plan. It's just drag and drop, and then you will understand some concepts about HTML elements and CSS, but without actually needing for you to code. I think that's an easy way of starting. Then, of course, if you want to do front end, it's HTML, CSS. I wouldn't really bother a lot with JavaScript. I don't think you need to go that deep, but just some basic stuff about the page, about styling, things like, for example, every element of the page is a rectangle. Even though we have complex shapes, circles, triangles, at the end of the day, everything's a rectangle. So stuff like that may be helpful. But I will start with Webflow, definitely.
That's a really interesting way to think about it. My immediate action would have been learn HTML and CSS, but you definitely, that's really interesting. And I think I learned a lot by using website builders like EditorX or Wix or yeah. I haven't yet used Webflow, but probably will. Yeah, interesting, really interesting. Another question, could you maybe suggest good sources for handoff files guidelines? Still figuring out how to make it the best way. So guidelines for handoff files, I want to jump in and say my perspective on that. I think that I don't know of any good sources for that. Maybe this is a nice post for UX goodies in the next couple of days. Nice idea. Nothing that comes to my mind, but I think that the guidelines, most of the times they're pretty specific to the company and the team. So I've in very technical products that I've worked on, the specifications were extremely robust and sophisticated, and everything was thoroughly explained, and all the use cases and all the rationale behind everything that was being built was in there in Jira as well, or in Confluence or whatever it was being documented. This was in bigger teams, and in startups there was like everything was in Vision at that point, let's say, or in another Handoff tool, or in Figma, and there wasn't that much of a need for very sophisticated Handoff guidelines. So I think what I'm trying to say is that it depends, like designers always say, but it is dependent to the team size, to the team dynamics, to the company, the product. And so but I will try to ask my design network for handoff files guidelines. Yeah, that's an interesting question. Do you have anything about that, Alex?
No, to be honest. I mean, I told you, for me, Figma and comments worked great so far. And asking specific questions if I didn't have the answer in Figma on Slack, and then updating the comments there, like like to have it there for the future. Like, yeah, that for me.
Okay, and I think we have time for like one last question. We're gonna be a bit over the 1 hour mark. How does the collaboration between developers and designers change when working for a startup? So I think you have experience in startups. I also have some opinions around that. If you could go ahead and share yours, and then I'll.
Yeah, so to be honest, I prefer startup, small teams. I think I really, it fits my style better than huge corporations. I mean, I like to get involved personally with the designer, with the founders, co-founders, and be like a strongly knitted team. I think in a startup, I mean, I don't, maybe you have some more experience in like in big corporations. I worked for 3 years in an outsourcing company which had around 100 employees here in Iași. We didn't have a designer at the time. The product owner was doing kind of design, but we weren't really involved, to be honest. Like, he was just doing it and like sending it, and was like, there wasn't really much questions and stuff like that. It was more like, okay, this is what we're thinking, just do it. In a startup, what I found is that kind of everybody does a little bit of everything. So, we're talking about a new feature. Of course, the designer is involved, the developers are involved, maybe the co-founders or the who's gonna sign off on it are involved. And I like this tightly knit collaboration more in a startup. And I think it also helps you develop like side skills. So I learned some UX better than I would have learned if I would just do coding. The designers also learn how to think and approach coding and so on. So, yeah.
Yeah, my take on this is that it's pretty it's fairly different in the sense that startups are much there's a much faster pace and things are more easy to unblock and just make things happen. So they move at a different pace, and so the collaboration is closer. The communication is sometimes better, other times because of the pressure and the constraints and the lack of resources sometimes it feels like it can be more uh difficult at some point. But overall I think it's the main difference is like the pace in which you're designing and improving and iterating and doing and experimenting and failing, while in big companies sometimes it took us like 2 years to launch something new, which is like unacceptable looking back. Yeah, so thank you to everyone who joined. I really appreciate first of all, thank you Alexandro for accepting this invitation and sharing so many valuable insights. Thanks to everyone who joined. Again, if you want to stay close to the Mento Design Academy, which is our UX bootcamp events, follow us on Meetup or obviously on Instagram. I also want to recommend following Alexandru. Maybe we will ask him to share his LinkedIn and maybe his Instagram page where he shares content about front end. Share them in the chat so that people can find you. And also, I want to invite everyone in this meeting to share their LinkedIn or other contact in the chat. So I will leave this room open for another 5 minutes so that we can connect with each other and feel that we actually got to know people from this event, and it's like a real meetup in a way. So everybody, please share your